Welcome to a new Byzantine dialogue from the Gennadius Library, a series of talks that explore various facets of Byzantium. I'm Maria Georgopoulou, I'm the director of the Gennadius Library, and today I'm very pleased to welcome Brad Hostetler, who is assistant professor of art history at Kenyon College, where he teaches courses in Greek, Roman, Byzantine, and Islamic art. Brad received his PhD from Florida State University 5 years ago with a dissertation, The Function of Text, Byzantine Reliquaries with Epigrams, 843 to 1204. Brad specializes in the art and material culture of late antiquity and Byzantium, with a particular emphasis on portable luxury objects, in the Middle Byzantine period. His research focuses on the relationship between text and image, including ekphrasis about and works inscribed on works of art. He's currently working on a book that examines the nature and meaning of relics and reliquaries in Byzantium through the lens of inscriptions, including, of course, the ways in which these inscribed texts mediate and guide the faithful's engagement with sacred relics, but also their understanding of these relics. Brad has published already 4 essays from his dissertation. 3 more are on the way. And he has also worked on signet rings, on Byzantine signet rings, and a forthcoming essay will appear next year in the Journal of the Walters Art Museum. He also has 2 more projects that he's working on with Florida State University professor Lynn Jones. The first is a catalog of Ethiopian objects that were donated to Kenyon College in 2019. And the second one is a handbook on Byzantine material culture to be published by Routledge. Brad's work has been supported by grants and fellowships from the Gladys Gribble Delmas Foundation, Dumbarton Oaks, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I'm proud to say that Brad is also an alumnus of our program here at the Gennadius Library, the Medieval Greek Summer Session, a wonderful language program fully funded by the Levendis Foundation. Before I give the floor to Brad, I want to remind you that we welcome your questions, but I would appreciate it if you can place them in the Q&A and not in chat. You can use chat for any other small business that you may have, and our videographer will help deal with those. Without any further ado, I would like to welcome Brad Hostetler, who will speak to us on relics, and the title is By This Conquer, Relics as Weapons in Byzantium. Brad.
Thank you, Maria, for that kind introduction and the invitation to speak. I'd also like to thank Konstantinos Tsirtsinis for technical assistance and Maria Smalley for setting up the event and creating a poster. Good evening, good day, and good morning to those of you who are joining us at this Byzantine Dialogues. I was part of the 2013 Medieval Greek Summer Session at the Gennadius Library, taught that year by Stratis Papagiannou and Alexander Alexakis. I learned so much through that very challenging month in July, I think it was, so very hot in Athens, but it was an incredible class and some amazing field trips. And I'm grateful for the friends and colleagues that I met through that experience. And I encourage graduate students to apply for this program. I am now going to share my screen. And hopefully it is now showing. In late summer of the year 958, in preparation for his second campaign against the Hamdanids, the Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos dispatched a written harangue that was read to his troops. At the end of his speech, he invokes the power of relics to aid in their mission. Sorry. First. Okay, here we go. After having drawn holy oil from the immaculate and most sacred relics, the Passion of Christ our true God, from the precious wooden fragments of the true cross and the undefiled lance, the precious titulus, the wonder-working reed, the life-giving blood which flowed from his precious rib, the most sacred tunic, the holy swaddling clothes, the God-bearing winding sheet, and the other relics of his undefiled passion, we have sent this holy ointment to be sprinkled upon you, for you to be anointed by it and to garb yourselves with the divine power from on high. As we can see, Constantine's invocation that relics of Christ's passion aid his soldiers in battle was not simply a rhetorical gesture. He accompanied his speech with holy oil that touched these relics and with which the soldiers were meant to anoint themselves. This holy ointment, or hiasma, is presented as a garment, an essential piece of equipment that protected and empowered them in battle. Relics were part of a category of Byzantine sacred objects, including icons and crosses, that accompanied the emperor and his troops on campaign. This practice has a long tradition. In the 4th century, the Emperor Constantine I supposedly fashioned his horse's bridle from nails of the crucifixion. In the 6th century, the Emperor Maurice attached wood of the true cross to the top of his spear. In the 7th century, the Emperor Heraclius is said to have taken a hieropoieton, an icon divinely created, as his military standard against the Sasanians. In the 11th century, the Emperor Alexios I Komnenos led his army with a sword in one hand and the Mephorion of Mary in the other. In the 12th century, the Emperor Isaac II lost in battle a reliquary that contained relics of the true cross, milk from the Mother of God, a piece of her girdle, and other relics. We have numerous textual accounts that document the presence of relics in war, whether they were taken into battle, lost in defeat, or recovered in victory, including, as we see here, the cloak of John the Baptist that was recovered by the Emperor Nicephorus II Phocas in his conquest of Aleppo in 962. My question today is, how were relics activated for these military contexts? How were they charged with the power to defend the army and defeat the enemies? Before we can go any further, we need to first understand what relics were. Relics were the sacred remains of and the things associated with Christ, the Mother of God, and the saints. This encompasses a wide variety of matter, including the bones and bodily remains of martyrs, as well as the clothes, objects, and other materials that these holy figures touched in their lifetimes. The tombs of saints also reportedly produced miracle-working fragrant oil, and this too could be considered a relic to the Byzantines. In short, the word relic is shorthand for a whole range of mundane materials that were believed to be the physical embodiment and real presence of the saints, and thereby share in the power of the divine. What's important to note here is that there is little to no visual or material distinction between the sacred remains of holy figures and the bones of any other person. Bone is bone, cloth is cloth, wood is wood. How then were relics distinguished from any other material substance? This is where the reliquary comes into play. Reliquaries are the containers that adorn, house, protect, and display relics. They were the material frame that transformed these mundane materials into something extraordinary and holy. The reliquary is there to validate a fragment of bone, a piece of cloth, a splinter of wood as a sacred thing. While the reliquary is in the service of the relic likewise needs the reliquary to activate its meaning, value, and function. And these functions varied. Relics were used in many aspects of Byzantine life, including feast day celebrations in the church, court ceremonial, diplomatic gift giving, personal devotional practices, and, as we shall see, military contexts. In this presentation, I look at the ways in which reliquaries, through their textual, material, and visual programs, activate the military meaning of relics. While I'll be touching upon the practical logistical use of relics in the military, I will be more focused on the rhetorical, that is, the ways in which the object, through a combination of textual and visual features, frame the relics in a particular way. My work is indebted to a number of foundational studies that have examined material and visual depictions associated with war and imperial victory, including those by Nancy Shevchenko, Nicholas Economides, and Robert Nelson. Where my research departs from these studies is through a focus on reliquaries and the ways in which they were designed to activate a relic's military function. My inquiry begins with inscriptions on these objects, including dedications in prose, as well as descriptive epigrams in verse. I argue for three main strategies of these texts: relics as weapons, relics as allies, and relics as typology, and show how these strategies are also communicated through the reliquary's forms, iconography, and materiality. I'm not arguing that every reliquary discussed here was necessarily used in a military context. Rather, I'm showing how reliquaries activate the victorious and protective nature of relics, whether the enemy is an earthly force or a spiritual one. No other relic was conceived as a weapon as often as the wood of the true cross. As the instrument of Christ's torture, its meaning was inverted by early Christian writers as a symbol of his victory. In his sermon on the adoration of the precious cross, the late 4th and early 5th century bishop of Constantinople, John Chrysostom, writes, "For the cross of the Lord is made a trophy bearing a victorious weapon, hoplon, an unconquerable weapon for emperors, a horn for the church, a destroyer of enemies, and salvation for the faithful." This framing of the cross as a victorious weapon occurs in conjunction with the Emperor Constantine the Great's appropriation of the symbol of the cross for his military standard. The 4th century bishop Eusebius of Caesarea, in his biography of Constantine, says that the emperor at some point prior to the battle at Milvian Bridge in 312 received a vision of, quote, "a cross-shaped trophy formed from light and a text attached to it which said, 'By this conquer,' and tuto nica." After contemplating his vision, Constantine fell into a sleep where Christ appeared to him in a dream, ordering him to, quote, "make himself a copy of the sign which had appeared in the sky, and to use this as protection against the attacks of the enemy," end quote. The next day, Constantine, quote, "summoned goldsmiths and jewelers, sat down among them, and explained the shape of the sign, and gave them instructions about copying it in gold and precious stones," end quote. Eusebius goes on to describe this cross-shaped battle standard, or labarum. He says that it included a banner, a wreath, a Cairo monogram, and portraits of the emperor and his sons. But over time, the Byzantines depicted the object of Constantine's vision in art as a gold and gemmed cross. In this depiction of the vision, from the mid-9th century manuscript known as the Paris Gregory, we see Constantine's vision shown as a gold cross lined with precious stones or pearls and inscribed with the words "en tuto nica," "by this conquer." Middle Byzantine sources also interpret this cross as a weapon for Constantine's victory. The Synaxarion of Constantinople, the 10th century service book that records brief notices of saints' lives, records on the feast day of Constantine and his mother Helena the vision in the following way: "Having confidence in the form of the precious cross, making it as a weapon out of gold, and taking it into Rome, he struck down the wicked Maxentius on the Tiber River, killing him near the Milvian Bridge and setting free the Roman citizens from this tyrant." Here we see the act of fashioning the cross being described as hoplopoesis, or making it as a weapon that was used to kill the tyrant Maxentius. This topos of the cross as a weapon, whether as a symbol or through the presence of relics, is one way in which inscriptions on reliquaries activate its military meaning. This large 13th century silver gilt cross, now in the cathedral at Genoa, displays on one side a central receptacle for relics of the true cross surrounded by gems and pearls. The reverse is covered with a repoussé inscription that reads, "Bardas fashioned this divine weapon, hoplon. Since it became time-worn, Isaac, Archbishop of Ephesus, restored it." Most inscriptions on reliquaries name the relics that are contained within the reliquary. Here we don't get that. The words cross, stavros, or xylon, wood, are avoided altogether. Instead, this object is identified as this divine weapon. We learn a bit more about the information. We learn a little bit more information about the history of this object when we read the verse inscription that was originally inscribed on the now lost case in which this cross was housed. This epigram was recorded prior to the loss of the case. The Caesar Bardos adorned the most venerable wood with gold and precious stones and pearls, a treasure which he placed on the altar of St. John the Theologian. Kyriakos, the bishop of the church, then made a gold container for it. Since these things had been damaged by the long passage of time, Isaac, foremost in the celebration of sacrifices, but also in his accomplishments, restored them to a better state. Based on these two inscriptions, it appears that the cross was first donated to the Church of St. John of Ephesus by a certain Caesar Bardos in the 9th or 10th century. Kyriakos, a bishop of Ephesus active in the 11th century, made the case for the cross. Both the cross and case had become worn over time, and so Isaac, a 13th century bishop of Ephesus, restored both objects. But it is only the processional cross, originally ordered by Caesar Bardos, that is identified as a weapon, hoplon, in its inscription. There are two known historical figures to whom this Caesar Bardos may refer. One is the Emperor Michael III's uncle, who held this title from 862 to 866, and the other is the father of Nicephorus II Phocas, who was Caesar a century later. Both men were active officers who led military campaigns during their careers, and so would have most likely taken a cross such as this one with them into battle. We don't know whether the original inscription on the cross, the one that would have been ordered by Bardos, identified the wood as a divine weapon, but we can see that Isaac, following his restoration and ordering of this new inscription, recognized a weapon-like meaning of this particular object due to its associations with one of these known military officials. Another way in which inscriptions frame the cross as a weapon is to indicate its effect on its enemies, describing it as crushing, defeating, or putting to flight the barbarians. This topos is found in a number of Middle Byzantine imperial reliquaries of the True Cross, including this one. The 10th century Limburg Stavrotiki, meaning box for a cross, consists of a shallow silver gilt box with a sliding lid, handle, and lock. The lid of the box is encrusted with gems and pearls and adorned with cloisonné enamel figures depicting the heavenly court, with Christ enthroned at the center of this composition. The lid slides open to reveal a removable cross at the center, surrounded by 10 rectangular hinged compartments containing relics associated with Christ, the Mother of God, and John the Baptist. The cross displays the wood of the true cross on the front, adorned with golden gems, and inscribed with a 9-verse epigram on the back that names the emperors, Constantine VII Prothogynetos and his son Romanos II. God spread out his hands on the wood, gushing forth through it the energies of life. Constantine and Romanos, emperors, with a synthesis of radiant stones and pearls, displayed it full of wonder. And in the past, Christ on this, having shattered the gates of Hades, resurrected the dead. Now the crown wearers, adorners, commanders of this, with it crushed the temerities of the barbarians. The final line indicates that the emperors used the cross to crush their enemies. This power is activated by the epigram's underlying comparison of the emperors to Christ. The linguistic building blocks in this structure are the two Mende constructions in verses 1 through 5 and verses 6 through 9. While these Greek words are rarely translated into English, men and de are used in correlative clauses to compare or contrast two different people or ideas. In this case, the word men prefaces the first person, God, in verse 1, Christ in verse 6, and de the second, the emperors in verse 3, and crown wearers in verse 8. Through this structure, we can see that there is an explicit typological comparison being made between Christ, who in the past shattered the gates of Hades, and the crown wearers who now crush the temerities of the barbarians. Such an imperial imitation of Christ, also known as Christomimesis, was a standard ideology that was conveyed in Byzantine art, literature, and panegyrics. For the cross epigram, Christomimesis is invoked to show that Christ's actions in the past guarantee the emperor's victories in the present. This epigram thus celebrates the emperors as both the patrons and owners of the true cross and as Christomimetic rulers who wield its power. Additional evidence for this multiveiling reading is found in the use of the word kosmetoris at the end of the epigram. One definition of this word is adorners, indicating that the emperors are the ones who have adorned the relic with, quote, radiant stones and pearls. But the word kosmetoris has an additional meaning that is relevant here, as reflected in my translation, one who marshals an army, a commander, a leader. This Homeric usage of the term is also attested in Middle Byzantine sources. And when the second definition is taken into consideration, the epigram claims that the emperors are the commanders of this, that is, the relics of the true cross, and use it to defeat their enemies. They are presented as generals who wield the relic and marshal its power for their victory. Relics of the true cross were not the only species of relic that were given this weaponized treatment. Historical sources speak to the many other types of relics that were expected to aid the emperor and his army in battle. This is also reflected in epigrams. A Middle Byzantine epigram that was inscribed in a now lost gold reliquary for a tooth of John the Baptist was documented in the 17th century, and it read, "While you see the dragon's molars, O Baptist, which have been threshed in the waters, may I, being prosperous with this, your molar, shatter all the molars of all sorts of enemies." The narrative being referenced by this epigram is Christ's baptism, when Satan, or demons represented here as dragons, were destroyed. This reference draws upon two different psalms. God crushed their teeth in their mouth, the molars of the lions, the Lord crushed together. It was you who strengthened the sea by your power. You crushed the heads of the dragons upon the water. The epigram combines these two Old Testament verses and reframes them as part of Christ's baptism. This association is also activated via its intertextuality with imperial ceremonial. On the Feast of the Epiphany, January 6th, the 10th century Book of Ceremonies dictates that members of the Blue faction are to proclaim to the emperors, "May he who has crushed the heads of the dragons in the streams of the Jordan, benefactors, crush before your feet the heads of the barbarians. May the thrice holy Trinity increase your victories, divinely crowned benefactors." As we can see, the Feast of Christ's baptism was a celebration of imperial victory. In the epigram, we find these meanings of victory applied to the relic. Wordplay on the word molar at the ends of the verses stress the importance of the tooth and its agency to smash on behalf of the relic's unnamed owner. The poet even used non-standard verb to describe the destruction, thresh, as opposed to crush or shatter, as we saw with the Psalms in the Book of Ceremonies, in order to describe the action of the molar grinding other molars and to have a term that contributed to the word play in each verse. As with the Limburg cross, the tooth of John the Baptist is not the object directly performing the action against the enemies, but rather the source of the owner's power and their ability to wield it. We also find these interrelated concepts of possession and power in an epigram that is inscribed on the 10th or 11th century silver arm reliquary for St. George, now in the treasury of San Marco in Venice. The Byzantine reliquary inside its Venetian casing is a conical shaped and largely unmarked silver sheath that has at the upper edge two verses inscribed around the rim. "Bearing a relic of the champion George, a fully armored faith, I rout the opponents." The unnamed owner claims that through his possession of George's arm, he is able to defeat his enemies. In addition to the arm, the owner possesses a fully armored faith, panoplon. This recalls Paul's letter to the Ephesians, in which he says, "Put on the full armor, panoplion of God, that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil." It is as if this epigram claims that the possession of the relic is what arms the faith of the owner. By describing his faith as fully armored, the unnamed owner might also be connecting this epigram to the silver casing that protects and arms the relic. In many epigrams of the Middle and Late Byzantine periods, the materials and adornments provided by the patrons were conceived as gifts and physical manifestations of their devotion, piety, and faithfulness. In this way, our unnamed patron forms a textual material correspondence between the epigram and the silver reliquary in order to convey his victory through the possession of his faith and George's arm. The second way in which relics' martial power was activated was through the belief that relics were the true presence of the holy and that they fought as allies for whomever possessed them. This is expressed in the 11th century epigram for a reliquary that belonged to Constantine I of Monomachos. We don't have the object. The epigram is transmitted in the Anthologia Marciana, a 13th century manuscript full of poetic inscriptions on works of art that date to the 11th and 12th centuries. The title given to this epigram in the manuscript indicates that it was inscribed in an encolpion that housed a part of the stone of unction and a piece of St. George's sword. Fight as an ally, Samaki, with your Constantine Monomachos, who is carrying to the chest a piece of the stone, O Christ, on which the burial shroud binds your corpse with embalmment, and a piece of the blade of your martyr, George. Christ is directly addressing and asked to fight as Constantine's ally, Samaki, a play on the name Monomachos. The pun and emphasis on these two words is indicated by their placement together at the end of the epigram in verse 4. Monomachos brought together two seemingly unrelated relics in a single reliquary. The stone of unction upon which Christ's body was laid at his burial is not normally invoked in such aggressive terms, but its apparent versatility allowed it to be the relic through which Monomachos could request Christ's military aid. The emperor buttresses his request for an ally by also including a military saint's relic that is unsubtly militant, a blade from St. George's sword. This kind of expression is different than what we've seen before. For the arm of St. George, the tooth of John the Baptist, and the cross of the Limburg Stavrotiki, it was through the patron's ownership of the relics that empowered them to defeat their enemies. For the Genoa cross, it was the relic and symbol that was the weapon. Here we see the relic is not necessarily the weapon, but rather the material presence of the holy who will fight alongside the emperor. This belief that Christ and the saints would fight as allies with the emperor was also expressed in hymns sung in religious services on campaign. One such service that dates to the 10th century is actually titled in this way, quote, an Aquilethea sung for the success of the army in its alliance, Samachia, with our Lord Jesus Christ, the all-holy Mother of God, the incorporeal ones, the apostles and the martyrs, end quote. Later in the service, the soldiers would sing, O Lord, ally to the most gentle David, you subdue the foreigner, you fight as an ally because of the faith of our emperor, and by the weapon of the cross, you strike our enemies. Here we see the invocation of the cross as a weapon, but also the call upon the Lord to fight as an ally with the emperor. While this hymn only makes oblique references to relics, epigrams on reliquaries and other historical sources make clear that the presence of relics certainly bolstered their claims that the heavenly forces were on the side of the emperor. In a 12th century encomium by Michael Italicos to the Emperor John II Komnenos, he inserts an invective against the Cilician Armenian prince Leo I, who had just been taken captive in the emperor's siege of Anazarbos. In this invective, Italicos questions Leo's hope that relics would protect him. Do you expect that the relics of the bodies of the heralds of Christ will protect you while you are under siege? Give up that hope. These spirits were our allies, and their bodies became ours. Here we see an explicit claim that whoever owns the relics are the ones who receive the benefit of the heavenly allied forces. For this reason, we find emperors desiring to acquire certain relics because those saints would then be with them in battle. In the first set of miracles of St. Demetrius, written in the first part of the 7th century by John, the Archbishop of Thessaloniki, we learn of an imperial request for relics of the martyr. The Emperor Maurice, who had heard about the many miracles performed by St. Demetrius, wrote to the Archbishop at the time in hopes of receiving a relic. The account tells us that this request was made because Maurice wanted, quote, by his faith to make him an ally in the war. The reliquaries of St. Demetrius offer us a glimpse into the ways in which this martyr was perceived as an ally. There are at least 10 extant Byzantine reliquaries associated with St. Demetrius, and they all date after the 11th century when it seems that the miron, or fragrant oil, first appeared at his tomb and became a central feature of his cult. All of his reliquaries share a few fundamental features, particularly their evocation of some aspects of the saint's shrine in Thessaloniki. This reliquary from Halberstadt is one example. It is a rectangular box as if it was conceived as a sarcophagus for the saint. It opens to reveal two compartments, one of which contains an image of the martyr lying in his tomb. And you can see that over here. I want to focus now on two reliquaries of St. Demetrius that possess a slightly different character and that they emphasize a militaristic aspect to his cult. The first is this 12th or 13th century encolpion at the British Museum. I should say an encolpion is a pendant, something worn on the chest. One half of the object survives to us. In its present form, we see a gold and enamel medallion featuring an image of St. George, with armor and a drawn sword in his right hand and a sheath in his left. The medallion is actually the back of the encolpion. It was originally hinged to a second medallion, presumably of the same size, that served as the front. The missing medallion on the front was replaced by this gold ring in the 18th century. We now have an unhindered view of the reliquary's interior, which features two images of the recumbent St. Demetrius, one in enamel on the hinged door and another embossed in gold behind it. I should note for clarity that these pieces of wood and other matter are a result of the 18th century alterations and should be ignored for our purposes. The military function of this object is conveyed by the epigram inscribed on the reliquary. One verse is inscribed along the circumference of the medallion, and another verse surrounds the image of St. George. We are missing the first two verses of this epigram, as they would have been inscribed on the missing medallion. Being anointed by your blood and miron, he, the owner, asks you, Demetrios, to be his fervent guardian in battles. There is a sentiment in this epigram similar to the one made by the Emperor Maurice. Both hope that the martyr, through the relic, would aid the wearer in battle. The epigram on the reliquary does not use the word ally to describe St. Demetrius, but it is clear that the owner perceived him as such in hopes that he would protect him in battle. This practice of anointing soldiers with St. Demetrius's miron is attested in contemporary sources. The 12th century historian John Scalitzes states that during the siege on Thessaloniki in 1040, illustrated here, the soldiers went to the tomb of the martyr, held an all-night vigil and quote, anointing themselves with the miron which flows from the sacred tomb, end quote. This belief in the presence and protection of St. Demetrius through his miron and blood is also conveyed by the epigram on another 12th and 13th century reliquary inculping St. Demetrius. This one, from Dumbarton Oaks, shares many similarities with the British Museum encolpion, but is more complete. The front of the gold and enamel medallion features a bust image of St. Demetrius in military costume. He wears a cuirass covered by a mantle and bears a lance in his right hand and a sword in his left. Saints Sergius and Bacchus are also military saints, are depicted on the reverse. Each is dressed in a long tunic covered by a mantle. They hold crosses in their right hands. The suspension ring at the top of the medallion unscrews and the front opens by a hinge at the lower end. The interior, made of gold, contains a pair of doors that enclose a second relief image of St. Demetrius. Here he is shown recumbent and within a niche, representing the saint in this tomb at Thessaloniki, just as we saw with the British Museum reliquary. The front and side of the medallion are inscribed with a 4-verse epigram. The faith of Sergius carries, together with the miron, the venerable container of the blood of Demetrios. He asks to have you as a deliverer in both life and death, together with the 2 prize-winning martyrs. The wearer of this reliquary encolpion, identified by the epigram as Sergius, asks St. Demetrios to be his deliverer. He creates an alliance between St. Demetrius and the 2 prize-winning martyrs, St. Sergius and Bacchus on the back, to protect him in life and death. What makes the reliquaries of the British Museum and Dumbarton Oaks so similar to each other and distinct from the other reliquaries of St. Demetrius is the way in which they also evoke their weapon-like purpose for the wearers. This, I argue, is done in 2 ways, iconographically and formally. Iconographically, what distinguishes these reliquaries from other reliquaries of St. Demetrius is the explicit militaristic role given to the depicted saints. The Dumbarton Oaks encolpion features a fully armed image of St. Demetrius in military costume bearing 2 weapons. This is unusual for his reliquaries, as he is normally depicted in court dress, a tunic covered by a mantle, as we saw in the Halberstadt reliquary. St. Sergius and Bacchus, also military saints, are not dressed in full military gear, but this is the only reliquary of St. Demetrius where these 2 military saints are featured. The presence of St. Sergius was certainly determined by the fact that he shares the name with the owner of this encolpion. The saints' identities as soldiers enhance the object's military reading. For the British Museum reliquary, we don't have the cover image of St. Demetrius, but it can be suggested that it looked very similar to the one on the Dumbarton Oaks reliquary, given the content of the epigram and the image of an armed St. George on the back of the medallion. On the Dumbarton Oaks reliquary encolpion, the request for St. Demetrius' protection is also suggested by the placement of names. Sergius's name is the last word of verse 2 and is placed above Demetrius's image at the 11 o'clock position of the circular frame. St. Demetrius points to his lance to the first letter, sigma, which can be interpreted as a response to the plea for protection made by Sergius in the epigram. Demetrius's name is the last word of verse 1 and is placed at the 5 o'clock position of the circular frame. In this way, the names of Sergius and Demetrios are literal and visual parallels to each other. They are the last words of their respective verses and are placed directly across from one another within the circular frame inscription. Situated between them is a protected image of St. Demetrios. The axis of his lance serves as a visual link between the names of the protector and the protected. These two encolpia can be distinguished from other reliquaries of St. Demetrios by their circular form. The others take the form of a rectangular box, like we see here with the Halberstadt reliquary, or this unique version in Moscow, which is designed as an image of St. Demetrius' ciborium. I suggest the circular form of the Dumbarton Oaks and British Museum encolpia may be understood as a reference to a shield. While Byzantine soldiers carried a variety of shield shapes depending on the era and their particular rank, round shields dominate in Middle Byzantine depictions of military saints, such as that of St. Theodore Stratolates in the Menelogian of Basil II. We might then view these small round encolpia as forms that are meant to evoke miniaturized shields that are worn in front of the body of the wearer to protect them against the enemies. This function is essentially how the 12th century Archbishop of Thessaloniki, Eustathios, interprets reliquary encolpia of St. Demetrius. While he says nothing about specific forms of the reliquaries, he does compare them to forged weapons, hopla, and like a shield, thoreos, that repel the arrows of the enemy. The epigram on the Dumbarton Oaks reliquary encolpion states the faith of Sergius carries the venerable container. Making one's faith the active agent in the production or use of a reliquary is not a common expression in epigrams. Sergius's activation of faith for his protection in battle recalls Ephesians 6:16. Besides all these, taking the shield of faith with which you can quench all the flaming darts of the evil one. When Sergius, by his faith, carried his venerable container, the image of Demetrius, his deliverer, was positioned before him as a front line of defense. The saint holds his spear upright, as if he is ready for battle. He points to and interacts with Sergius's name, identifying the one he has entrusted to protect. Typology is the third way in which reliquaries frame the victorious power of the relic and the success of its owner. For inscriptions on relics of the true cross, one of the most common themes that conveyed the victory-bringing protective nature of the relic was by associating the contemporary emperor with Constantine the Great. Middle Byzantine emperors, as new Constantines, marched into battle with their own weapon of the cross. In the 10th century, the Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos ordered in his military treatises that a reliquary of the true cross and a large gem-encrusted processional cross be carried in front of him when marching into battle. This topos of New Constantine spans throughout Byzantine history, but is inflected in specific ways in the context of epigrams on reliquaries of the true cross. The most overt example is an epigram penned by the 11th century poet John Meropos for a stavratiki owned by the Emperor Constantine IX Monomachos. The only information we have on this reliquary is the epigram transmitted by a manuscript ordered by the poet himself. Again, the light of the cross, again, a Constantine. The first Constantine saw its image through the stars, and the second sees the thing itself and carries the adored object in faithful hands. Both have received their power from it, and both revere it as their benefactor. The homonymity of the two emperors, Constantine I and Constantine IX, serves as the centerpiece by which to associate the present ruler with the past. Both put their faith in the sign and both derive their power and victory from it. The implication of this comparison is that Constantine IX is a type of the first, and his stavratiki is a type derived from the vision. The victory granted to Constantine I through his vision guarantees, therefore, the victory for Constantine IX via his relic of the true cross. We see this direct line of succession conveyed by other epigrams, such as this one described on the back of the 10th century ivory stavratiki on the Church of San Francesco in Cortona. This epigram, written on the back in the shape of a cross, reads, "And formerly to the powerful Emperor Constantine, Christ gave the cross for salvation. And now having this, the ruler, according to God, Nikephoros, puts to flight the tribes of barbarians. This epigram creates a direct line from Christ to Constantine I in the past to the Emperor Nicephorus, who we believe to be Nicephorus II Phocas in the present. This is succinctly visualized on the front of this ivory panel. Here we find a receptacle, the true cross, at the center. In the medallions above the cross, Christ is at the center, flanked by the archangels Michael and Gabriel. In the medallions below the cross, Constantine is flanked by his mother Helena and Saint Longinus. The medallion with Christ at the upper end is connected to the medallion with Constantine at the lower end by the vertical axis of the true cross. While Nicephorus is not depicted on this side of the reliquary, his presence is suggested by his likeness to that of Constantine, who wears the imperial regalia of a 10th century Byzantine emperor. The victorious emperor as a type of Constantine and the relic of true cross as a type of the vision is best conveyed by an epigram that was written for a reliquary of the true cross commissioned by Manuel I Komnenos. This reliquary no longer exists, but our knowledge of it is documented by a 24-verse epigram preserved in the Anthologia Marciana. According to the text, the epigram was for a reliquary of the true cross that Manuel commissioned for his campaign against the Seljuks in Anatolia. The first 13 verses, which I will not read here, speak to Manuel's desire to liberate former Byzantine territory in Anatolia. The second half of the epigram provides a brief description of the reliquary and features the themes of relics as weapons, as allies, and as typology. Beginning with verse 14, this epigram reads, knowing that the form of the cruciform divine wood, victory was seized by Constantine the Great, whose crown bears the Orthodox faith. He, Manuel himself, adorns the same form with gold, placing inside the signs of Christ's passion and pieces of relics of venerable saints, determining to trust in these rather than the multitude of his army. Manuel is presented here as an imitator of Constantine. Just as the first emperor claimed victory by his cross, so too does Manuel with his relic of the true cross. And like Constantine, who made his own sign out of gold and precious stone, so too does Manuel create a cross of the same form and inscribed with his own message of victory. The kind of reliquary being described here is nothing unique to Manuel. There are a number of imperial reliquaries of the true cross that follow this model: a golden gemmed cross with relics of the true cross, and an inscription that celebrates their victories. We know this formula we saw this formula for the epigram on the cross of the Limburg Stavritiki. What the inscription of Manuel's reliquary makes explicit are the ways in which such gold and gemmed crosses sponsored by Middle Byzantine emperors may be seen as visual types for the cross of Constantine I's vision. In fact, this act of imitation was not simply one of imagination. A 6th century cleric and historian says that in the Great Palace in Constantinople, there was a gemmed cross containing a relic of the true cross that was associated with Constantine I. Later sources also attest to this object. The 10th century Byzantine Book of Ceremonies mentions the, quote, great cross of St. Constantine the Great that was processed in imperial ceremonies. So our emperor could be New Constantine through imitation by creating their own gemmed and gold crosses equipped with relics of the true cross that would act as a weapon for their victory. This expression of victory is given in the final 4 verses of Manuel's epigram, where the cross is called upon to act as a weapon. Yes, cross, rod, strike the opponents. Yes, army of Christ, rout the Persian tribes, and falling all in line all around the emperor, crown his crown with the crown of victory. Here he calls upon his heavenly allies by the relics of the Christ's passion and those of venerable saints to serve as his army who will rout the Persian tribes. We also see the cross compared to a rod striking his opponents. When Byzantine writers discuss the cross as a rod, it is most often in the context of identifying the rod of Moses as a prefiguration of the cross of Christ. Moses served as a model for Byzantine emperors. Eusebius paralleled Constantine's use of the cross in his triumph over Maxentius with Moses' use of the rod in his defeat of Pharaoh. This typology between the Middle Byzantine Emperor, Constantine I, and Moses was given visual expression in court ceremonial, when the so-called Great Cross of Constantine the Great and the Rod of Moses were processed together with the emperor on major feast days. In the performance of these objects with the contemporary emperor, one can see how the epigram for Manuel's cross established a clear typological link between himself and these past models, and how his cross is like that of Constantine and the Rod of Moses. Manuel's epigram is the only reliquary epigram for which we have a specific military context. The battle at Maricephalon in 1176 was a disastrous loss. Various historical sources tell us that a reliquary of the True Cross was lost in battle and a ransom for its return. We don't know if the reliquary described by this epigram is the same one that was lost, but it is likely. But that's not really the point here. Epigrams like the ones I've discussed in this presentation are encomiastic. Their content is not dictated by the reality of events. Rather, they reflect and strive for a different reality, one that expresses the eternal victory of the emperor over his enemies, both earthly and spiritual. The reliquaries that we saw here are part of a process of requesting, hoping for, and in many cases expecting a certain victory. We see how relics are invoked as weapons, either explicitly or by showing the damage that they can inflict upon the enemy. We also saw how saints, through their material remains, are invoked as allies for their owners. If one only possesses the sacred material, surely the holy will be present with them. And we also saw how the use of typology was a way to frame the contemporary emperor and his contemporary object as one that shares in the power and effectiveness of the first Christian emperor and his cross. We also saw how reliquaries, through their materiality, iconography, and formal qualities, enhance these readings and empower the object. Relics need reliquaries, not only for protection, but also to frame the meaning and to harness the power. They are the objects of activation so that a relic can perform as a weapon on behalf of its owner. The militaristic themes, topo, and imagery were all part of the poets' and artists' arsenal. They conceptualized these sacred objects as weapons that could be marshaled by their owners for their victory and for their physical and spiritual protection. Thank you.
Thank you, Brad, for this close reading of the reliquaries and the epigrams, of course, which it comes to no surprise that when we do have the object and the epigram, we actually manage to have a much more refined and rich meaning of the object. There are already questions coming in, so I will refrain from asking my questions. And I will start with the first question that came in, which has to do with the performative function, if you will, of these epigrams. And the question by Andrei Prohin is whether we know if these epigrams were ever performed before battle or during a siege to activate, so to speak, the reliquary. Were there any ceremonies that we know of?
We don't know about any specific ceremonies where epigrams were read before battle, but that is a strong possibility. We have evidence. I mean, our general assumption is that epigrams were meant to be read. They had this sort of poetic and verse rhythmic structure does sort of lend itself to that oral performance. And so we can, there is a possibility that this was the case. And for the case of the long 24 verse epigram for Manuel's cross, there is some suggestion that this was actually something that was read as part of a dedication, that once the object is dedicated and presented, that this is something that would be read. So we don't have direct evidence, but it would seem that this would be a strong possibility given some of the general context of these objects. Thank you for the question.
There is a very specific question, and seen of the time of the question when it was posed, it's about, I think, the St. Demetrius Encolpion at Dumbarton Oaks. And Karen Garnett asks if she thinks or she sees that the eyes of the saint seem to look at the spear. Is this typical?
Right, and so I've actually written a little bit about this feature, in that the eyes of Demetrius on these reliquaries are kind of all over. Sometimes they look straight ahead, sometimes like in other directions. But yeah, in this case, Demetrius is looking towards the spear. He's also looking in the direction of Sirius's name. And another way we could interpret this too is that he's also looking to the two military saints, Sergius and Bacchus, on the back, as part of that request of, together with the two victorious martyrs, that they fight together. So yeah, I think there's an aspect here that could be read into the how the eyes play into this. Yeah, thank you for that question.
Do we have references to the efficiency of relics in Byzantine literature? And this is by Aristoteles Koskinas.
I'm sorry, the efficiency?
Do we know, do we read about relics being efficient? I guess this is the question. Do the Byzantines tell us that relics are efficient?
That they actually
that
do
they
what
worked.
they're supposed to do, that they worked. Well, I think maybe, so we do have these instances where relics are lost, and so the cross that I mentioned of Isaac II, that was lost in defeat. And then also, as I mentioned too, that the cross of Manuel's was also lost. And so there is, these documented accounts of being lost, but I would say probably the fact that these things were used, there is a belief that they were effective, that they actually did the job that they were supposed to do, or at least that they believe them to do the, attributing them to that victory. So I can't think of anything. Well, I guess we could say that there are many accounts where through a victory, through some sort of conquest, like the image I've showed of Nicephorus II, that relics were acquired as part of the loot, the booty from a victory. So that could be seen as part of this effectiveness, that the relics, or the saints, were wanting to be captured and rescued and taken back to Constantinople. And so, but I'll have to think about that more, if there's like a direct sort of statement of effectiveness there. So thank you for that question.
A question about the way saints are depicted in military garb. When do we begin to see saints depicted in military garb? And this is a question by Arthur Urbano, and saying that in late antiquity, the saints would be seen with the pallium. When does this change happen? And do you think there is a connection between the interpretation of relics, reliquaries, and the iconography?
Right. So thank you for that question. This one I would have to attribute to Professor Robert Nelson in an article that which he sort of identifies that, especially for Saint Demetrios, I mean, the earliest, I think it's the Psalter of Basil II, circa 1000, that features, I think maybe the earliest image of Saint Demetrios in military garb. And you're right that before that time, we typically find military saints wearing that cloak, and so we don't get that fully armed image. And so maybe around the 10th century, and we could maybe attribute that to some of the military expansion, and especially under Basil II and some of his predecessors, that there is this interest in trying to call upon these military saints to aid them. And I would just also say that there's this great church, the Pigeon House Church, Javashine, where it's got this entire wall of these martyrs, these saints. They're all dressed in military garments, and it dates to the mid-10th century. So I think that's probably where we would place that. And I think there could be something said about the correspondence to the military events, the conquests that are going on at that time in the 10th century. Thank you for that question.
A question by Florian Kurta. If faith activates the divine assistance, as in the case of the Engolpion of St. Demetrius, could it be that the relics presented as opla are in fact the instruments of faith? In other words, could it be that faith works through the relics, not the other way around? Or, to put it in a slightly different way, what exactly is the weapon? The faith or the relic?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I think that the faith is the necessary ingredient here to actually to have that belief in that the object would be effective. And maybe this goes back to our that other question about, that there is this belief that these things work. And so maybe that's the fundamental underlying principle here, that it's one thing just to say it in the inscription, but it really kind of relies upon the initial faith of the patron, the owner, and generally the military also believing that this thing is going to work. And think about that speech at the beginning of my talk of that Constantine VII sends this ointment for the soldiers to anoint themselves. And so, Constantine is expressing this faith. He goes on and he does express that faith and believing that this is what will inspire them and protect them, and so he has faith in that, but it would also require I guess the faith in the soldiers that this actually work too. So yeah, thank you for that question.
I'll try to combine. There are many questions coming, but anyway, I'll try to bring more of them together. John Penniman, I'm curious, when he says thank you, and your presentation was clearly speaks to the violent power of relics, and he's curious if they had also a defensive use, so to speak. You mentioned how the oil that touched the relics of a saint could be used to anoint soldiers going into battle. Given the often healing use of reliquary oil, is there evidence that it was used to treat wounds or the wounded following some kind of problem? Similarly, do the medical saints Cosmas and Damian ever appear in discussions of military battle contexts?
Oh, those are great questions. Oh my. Yeah, I'd have to think about
that. I didn't manage to shorten it. I mean, it was one question.
The healing power, the sort of post-war healing power, especially of oil. I mean, I think I can't recall of a specific reference right now, but I think Demetrios was using that way. But I would have to really think about that. I like that question. And then also, yeah, Cosmos and Damien, any of these healing saints. Also, excellent question. I don't know. I don't have a specific answer for you here, but it's something I'm definitely going to think about. Thank you for that.
Does belief in the power of the relic as a weapon have to be shared by the enemy for it to be deemed effective? Nicholas.
Right. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know, but I think the enemy would, and here I'm thinking of maybe the non-Christian adversaries of the Byzantine Empire, that there would be there is a recognition that it has value. As I mentioned with this cross that was lost at the Battle of Maracephalon in 1176. I mean, it was captured and ransomed back, and so the Seljuks understood that this had value to the Byzantines, and this was going to they would be able to sort of ransom this thing back. And I think the same could be said for Heraclius and the True Cross. That the Sasanians capturing the relic, taking it back to Ctesiphon. This is something that they would see as a statement of that they have captured the source of power, or something that's really significant to the Byzantines. And so I don't know to what extent that where does that belief, how far does that belief stretch? But at least in these kinds of examples, it seems that there is a recognition of that. So yeah, thank you for that question.
Were the relics, or could reliquaries and relics be seen as being deliberately employed to boost the morale of the soldiers? Petros Nicolaou.
Right, I think that's probably what's, that's probably what's going on with that speech that I opened the talk with. That there is, and other scholars have said this too, that especially like the sign of the cross, and then there's all the chants, the chants that the army would say that to victory through the cross, and that sort of thing. That this is all to kind of inspire that courage, that camaraderie, that there's a devotional aspect to it, a religious aspect to it, but I think there's also kind of that rallying cry, something that will give them the courage to fight on. So I think that's an important aspect to look at these. That part of the faith is also in the communal performance of it.
How does the use and perception of relics, this is Maria Lidova asking, as weapons correlate with the sacralization of actual arms and weaponry via accompanying text for form and benediction of weapons?
Okay, I'm sorry. Can you repeat that question?
Yes.
Again?
How does the use and perception of relics as weapons correlate with the sacralization of actual arms and weaponry via accompanying text, form, in parentheses, sword handle looking like a cross, etc., and benediction of weapons?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I don't know. Maria, thank you for that question. That's a good one. Yeah, to think about how actual relics play into this. I mean, we do have evidence of something like shields. I mean, this is something that goes back Roman period too. The shields having apotropaic devices on them, and then in the Byzantine period, we do read of some sources that describe like images of saints on shields, and so there could be an aspect of sacralization of these armaments to also help and aid in battle. But that's a good and that's a good question in terms of thinking about the larger picture of everything that's worn, everything that's taken, that process. So yeah, thank you.
You spoke of various inscriptions and epigram brought on to crosses and mentioning the emperor in a Christomimetic fashion. Who do you think were the audiences of these inscriptions, which contributed to the activation of the relics, given the various levels of literacy in Byzantium, both at court and society at large? This is Christopher Sprecher.
Right. So I think if we can follow the assumption that inscriptions, especially verse inscriptions, were read in some context, read out loud in some context, that helps with sort of resolving the literacy issue. But I think something like the Limburg cross that is highly encomiastic. I mean, it's really directed to a specific kind of audience, a courtly audience. But these kinds of statements, just like we find visually represented in art, that they are all there to kind of buttress the praise of the emperor in some way. So there is, part of the argument that I'm making here is that there is like this activation of the object, but then also they're not alone either. These kinds of inscriptions are not alone. They're all part of a larger program of images too that are there to lift and support the emperor and who he is, the person of the emperor, who he is in that office. And so I may have gotten far away from the question, but I think in short, the audience I think is for the court. I mean, especially something like the Limburg Stavratiki.
Ivan Durpic, thank you for a great talk. In epigrams that frame relics as weapons, barbarians are often mentioned together with demons. Is it possible that generic references to battles, especially in epigrams on objects designed for personal use, e.g. encolpia, might point specifically to spiritual battles?
Right. I think, I mean, and I do try, I did want to sort of be careful not to suggest that the objects that we're talking about here are, these are actual things that are pulled out and taken into battle. I think what is probably most, another way to say this would be that there is this rhetoric around relics acting as weapons, serving as weapons, but that rhetoric is not directed to a specific kind of military campaign, but instead of the general need for protection in life, the spiritual forces that one faces. And so I think any of these could be be applicable to that. Borrowing the language of the ceremonial language of the emperor defeats the barbarians, borrowing that, putting that on the object, then can be seen as a way that these objects are meant to sort of protect against all sorts of enemies, and that we shouldn't read it too closely that they're specifically for a actual military context. Yeah, thank you for that question.
I will combine two questions. Anne-Marie Whale-Carr says, do we know of instances in which a disappointed owner or an enemy took vengeance against a saint by defacing a reliquary? And the other question, Jacqueline Mann, can you please speak a bit about relics not working in the way they were intended to?
Yeah. Oh.
I hope I'm right in combining them.
Yeah. For Professor Carr's question, I can't think of an example here where there is like violence done against the saint, and it's an interesting question to think about. What happens when the saints don't do what one hopes that they do? And I don't know. I'm wondering if an object's just so like these instances where relics are actually lost in battle. I mean, is this a an acceptance by the owner in some way, like there's a disappointment, but then also a recognition of like the saint was against us in this situation? I don't know. I mean, I think that's just something I'll have to think about more. What happens on the negative side of things? That goes for both questions, and I can't. I'm sorry, I can't answer them fully. So, but thank you for those.
There is a question, Ian Begg, about relics used by Muslims or Israelites, I guess, because the question starts, the Israelites carried the Ark of the Covenant in battle. Did Muslims ever have or carry relics, for example, during the Crusades? Oh my, yeah, that's outside of my area of expertise, but I would be very interested in knowing about this. So if there is somebody out there who knows, I will gladly take some suggestions on that. I don't know, but yeah, that's really a great question. Well, take the cross-cultural. We'll look into it, right?
Yeah,
continue the discussion. A question, can you please comment more about the interesting situation of relics within a relic, remains of saints inside the Stavrotek, for instance?
Yeah. Why? Why do they do this? And it's a really great question. So the Limburg Stavrotek, which I showed, I talked just about the cross, but there are these 10 additional compartments in there, and these are all relics that can be documented in Constantinople by the time of this object's creation, 10th century. They're all located in important imperial foundations in the capital, either in the Great Palace or in important imperially sponsored churches. And so Nancy Savchenko has kind of argued for the Limburg Stavratiki that that's this kind of portability of the capital, out on campaign. So you have a little piece of this relic, a little piece of this relic contained within this box, and you are basically having the supernatural defenders of the capital that have protected the city for centuries, and now you are kind of bringing them all together into this one object and taking it on a campaign. But that describes one that one reliquary. I mean, there are other kinds of reliquaries that don't necessarily or don't have such an overt, explicit military kind of context that also have multiple relics. And what's the point of that? And I think there's a bit about the kind of gathering more of the saints, maybe gathers more of the power together in one place for whatever purpose that you are needing them for. But yeah, it's a great question of what do we do with these reliquaries that have so many relics in them? And I think there's probably several answers to that question.
There are a couple of questions that try to take us back to Greco-Roman usage of similar things, the use of religious items in battles and war, if there is any parallel. And another question, if you see any continuity in social and the ideological value of the pre-Christian Roman standards, especially the Republic and later Empire, until, of course, Constantine changed the iconography.
Right. I mean, we do have maybe the Palladium of Troy might be an example of this, of an object that has kind of like this embattled history of being stolen and kind of having this military context, and then also battle flags and banners that might also be seen as these pre-Christian practices. And I don't know exactly what to do with all that, because I think there is definitely a connection in terms of this is, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is part of a long tradition, and I just sort of cited from Constantine onward, but I mean, really, it goes further back than that. And as somebody mentioned too, the Ark of the Covenant, I mean, this is part of that ancient tradition of taking some sort of religious item into battle with you. And I don't have an answer, but that's something that that I'm thinking about. And if there's anybody out there who has suggestions on where to go next with that, I would very much appreciate it. Thank you.
There is a question about whether there are occasions in which emperors would prefer a particular mode of invoking these relics, either as a weapon or as a holy presence or as typography, or were these sort of invocations used interchangeably? And I'm not sure that you can really answer this question, but anyway.
Yeah, well, I don't, I think, well, of the three of the three modes that I cited here, and there are probably others that I'm not thinking about, but I tried to like distill it down into sort of these three modes. And I think, yeah, I don't know. I think maybe typology is something that is we could probably associate the most with emperors and how they kind of invoke these relics, either with Constantine, but then also that cross at the Limburg Stavratiki, as I mentioned earlier on, that there's also a typology between the emperors and Christ. And so, this typology kind of extends to in a variety of ways. And so I think, emperors have an interest in sort of always connecting themselves to some model that is an honorable model that they follow, and that then their object is also kind of participating in that imitation as well. But a good question to think about, who would use what kind of typology, or what kind of mode in this way.
But presumably, I mean, you don't use the relic just for one, for a particular thing. I mean, you presumably, if it's a working relic, you take it along every time you go in battle, right?
Right.
Or you hope that you will live to have it with you the next time.
Right. And I think that's something that I don't really say here, is that I think what we can say about relics in Byzantium is something we can also probably say about icons too, and is that these kinds of sacred objects are really kind of versatile, and that they aren't going to be, there isn't going to be a prescription for them to do one kind of thing, and that you'd want them to, you might have them for some sort of, used in religious, some sort of religious feast day service, but then you might also then take that and take it with you on campaign. And, there's evidence of that that certain objects in Byzantium, and I'm not just talking about relics or icons, but certain objects in Byzantium that had this sort of like multi-purpose use, and that I think that ability to be flexible and wanting to use it in a variety of ways is also kind of a characteristic of these objects, that we can't sort of prescribe a very specific meaning on them either.
There is a question about the appearance of relics in military handbooks. The anonymous attendee says that he or she thinks that they're virtually absent in that context, which might indicate that their effectiveness was not regarded as serious as the epigrams would suggest.
That's a great point. Yeah, you look through the military handbooks and it's like, yeah, relics are not, do not feature prominently, hardly feature at all. There are these, there's this military treatise of Constantine VII, where we get this one indication of, how everybody's supposed to line up. And then in front of the emperor, we've got one of the officials who's going to be carrying this reliquary of the true cross in a case around their neck, and they're going to be processing in front of him. And then before that, they're going to have a gem cross. And I mean, that's one instance where we have in this kind of these sort of military handbooks or military treatises that describe what happens on campaign, the actual logistical aspect. And so, yeah, what do we do with this absence? And I think that's a really good point you make, that, are the epigrams protesting too much here, that they don't actually, they weren't perceived to that extent. And that's a really good point.
There is a question by Albert Kezel. One point, hoplon first means tool, and then by extension to soldiers, their tool, the weapon. The word hoplon is not intrinsically military. Somewhere I've seen hopla to means pots and pans, the tools of a kitchen.
Mm-hmm. Great point. Yeah. So thank you for that. For that clarification. That's something I'll have to go back and really think about that more. Thank you.
Eston Adams writes, it is known that Byzantine iconoclasts made an exception for the image of a cross. It is also known that in addition to destroying icons, iconoclasts destroyed relics. Do you know whether there's evidence that they made an exception for relics of the cross?
Yeah, so relics of the cross, there's mixed sources here in terms of what actually happened to relics during this period of iconoclasm, and it seems that the symbol of the cross was the acceptable image, And relics of the cross, there is some evidence that it was also in use, but in terms of how, you know, to what extent they were also used in military contexts, you know, what do we do with the absence of sources? You know, as the one questioner asked about the military handbooks, you know, do we assume that they continued that practice of taking relics into battle, or was that discontinued as well? So yeah, I'll have to think about that more in terms of iconoclasm and how that worked.
Susan Allen tells us that Alexander said to have carried with him into battle arms thought to date from the Trojan War.
I love it. Yeah, thank you.
We would love to have a reliquary.
Yeah.
And I have two more questions, and I think, to be fair to you, we'll probably wrap up with those. Actually, one of them is a comment. The first is by Nikolaos Chrysis. Thank you for the interesting paper. In what way, if any, would you say that the evidence you just presented about relics in war contributes to the larger issue and debate about holy war in Byzantium?
Yeah,
Not a small question.
Yeah, I don't know if I can. Yeah, I can even address that. And yeah, that is. If I heard the name right, yeah, I know that Christos is one who has worked on this. So I don't know. I don't know how this would contribute to that. Whether, to what extent these are. Yeah, just part of the practice, or if this does say something about, you know, how they framed, you know, the mission of what it was they were doing and seeing it as holy war. So yeah, very good question, and I'm sorry I can't even answer that. Thank you.
And Anna Kartsonis says that, you know, it's not a question but a comment, and she has enjoyed your talk. A suggestion rather. It would be interesting if you would contrast this material to the way private reliquaries carrying relics were believed to function as protectors of their owners at some later point in your work. Excellent presentation. Thank you. So I don't know if you want to address this or.
Yeah, I think this comes back to what Ivan Derpic asked too about, you know, these motifs that we find in these inscriptions. You know, are these, you know, really invoking some sort of military context, or do we want to see this as kind of protection against, you know, the spiritual forces as well? And I think that's where these kind of two comments come together. And yeah, I think that's a really good point to think about. You know, a cautionary statement here of, you know, not overreading into these objects as having this purely military function, but that, you know, maybe these personal objects are also kind of participating in or harnessing that power that these relics have, but for personal devotional use. So yeah, thank you very much for that question or comment.
I think we have covered a lot of ground with the questions, but will you allow me to ask a bit of a different question? In your work about the reliquaries, and I wanted to sort of have a peek into your book, the military part or the weapon part or the ally, the battle part is, I assume, one way or one aspect of what you're doing in your work, right?
Mm-hmm, right.
Could you give us briefly the other aspects that you have worked on?
Right. Well, the sort of central approach here to, you know, what I'm doing is looking at what can these inscriptions say about the perception, use, and meaning of relics. And so, you know, by looking at these, this is one way in which we could look at this and say, okay, there's this militant either directly military use or evoking that kind of military power kind of use in the relic. But there's also ways in which we could sort of view these inscriptions and how they facilitate kind of a spatial engagement with the object, especially with some of these reliquaries of Saint Demetrios that, well, not even just the reliquaries of Saint Demetrios, but reliquaries have this kind of, they're three-dimensional. They are solid things with multifaceted and physical forms that have inscriptions on multiple sides. And so if we think about how one even engages with the object, from picking it up, handling it, opening it up, to reading the inscription, looking at the images, just that process of reading and looking can also kind of dictate a certain kind of experience of the object. So there is kind of like a spatial dimension to it, and kind of simulating a pilgrimage aspect to these relics. We can also look at these inscriptions to understand like how were the forms of reliquaries, how were they perceived. So Byzantine reliquaries kind of have this, especially Middle Byzantine reliquaries can really be distinguished from Western medieval reliquaries, their contemporaries in the West, by there's a very limited range of forms that these objects take, and where they really kind of get creative and get and kind of really explore the different options of these objects is through kind of the interactive quality of these objects. So what really what kind of defines these objects is by the ability to open them up and get from the outside to the inside and get to that relic. And so there are a number of kind of textual strategies that kind of describe that approach to the relic, to accessing the relic, to kissing the relic, to touching the relic, that lead us there. There's also ways to look at these inscriptions and help us understand like the forms, so that in some cases where we are meant to perceive a certain object as representation of the heavenly Jerusalem, or as an object that is meant to evoke some sort of space and site that we are supposed to travel to. So there's a real narrative quality to these objects that, because of these epigrams, and sometimes these epigrams can be kind of discounted as not having so much value, but there is a lot that can be dug out through these texts, especially if we sort of look at them in context with their object and how they're handled.
Well, thank you very much, Brad, for this rich presentation that made us think, and it's very clear from the 25 questions that you answered, a marathon. That the material you presented really resonated with our audience. So thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you in Greece maybe sometime soon. And have a very good day, all of you.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Bye.